Welcome to this ASQ webcast presentation titled Best Practices, How Technology Can Enable Your Remote Audits. I'm Pablo Baez with ASQ, and today we have with us presenting on this topic, Pete Miller. Now, a little bit about Pete before we get things started. So Pete is President and CEO of Dynamic Compliance Solutions, Inc., where he's worked in quality and regulatory compliance within the pharmaceutical, biotech, and medical device industries for over 30 years. His background in biomedical, electronic engineering, and information technology has qualified him for unique roles in guiding the advancement of quality management systems in the life science industry. He has extensive experience with quality assurance, quality control, computer science validation, and 21 CFR Part 11 compliance. He successfully implemented numerous QMS, CSV, and auditing programs in small, medium, and large-scale life science organizations. He's been a leader in the development and implementation of software as a service, or SaaS, for quality systems for several pharmaceutical and biotech companies. And Mr. Miller has previously served on the Audit Guidance Advisory Board, supporting the advancement of supplier auditing criteria and shared auditing standards such as TR32 and RX360. Most recently, Mr. Miller has been working on advancing technology and standards to support remote auditing. In this webcast, Peter Miller will walk you through and explain how certain technologies can positively impact your remote auditing needs and the best practices of successful remote audits. So thanks, Peter, for kindly offering to share your expertise on this topic with our quality community. Now let me pass the microphone over to you to get things started.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. Hi, everybody. This is Pete Miller from Dynamic Compliance Solutions. Today's webinar will help you understand how certain technology can positively impact your remote audit needs. From a definitional perspective, we'll consider remote, virtual, hybrid audits to mean that the majority or all of the audit assessment or inspection, whatever you're calling it, is being performed by an auditor who is off-site. Another definition that references to video don't always mean recording is being created. For example, describing the difference between a web conference connection as being an audio or a video, that doesn't necessarily mean that the video is being recorded. So you may hear the term video mentioned throughout this audit, doesn't necessarily mean it's being recorded. Regardless of the type of audit or inspection that you are performing, these technology help you connect the auditor to the audit site. Our focus for this webinar, however, will be the typical GMP or Good Manufacturing Practices audit, since this type of inspection incorporates the largest spectrum of activities that are used in a typical audit. These types of audits are regularly performed at service providers such as a contract manufacturing organization or CMO, regardless of whether the CMO is producing a finished drug product or a medical device, or simply one of the ingredients or components for your product. So to start off, let's just do a quick overview of what we're going to cover today. We'll talk briefly about when and why you might use remote auditing in comparison to an on-site audit. And then we'll talk about the common audit practices and then break down those practices and talk about the use of technology to facilitate each one of these components. So whether they're using them all or in part, the technology component should help you to come up with a best practice that you can have a discussion with the audit site and make sure that they're okay with utilizing this type of an approach. Towards the end, we'll talk about frequently asked questions that we get from auditors and audit sites. And then we'll circle back to recommend what the best practices are so that you can have that clear in your mind when we're finished with the webinar. So from a background perspective, we're doing this webinar for many reasons. You already know the quarantine, the shutdown in terms of transportation and travel restrictions. In addition, shortages of critical medical equipment, including drugs and devices such as respirators. The economic impact, which is having an impact globally. All organizations are feeling this, and so the better we can perform our audits in a economically or fiscally responsible way, the better off we will be. Additionally, back to normal is sort of disappearing in the rearview mirror. The new normal, in our case, isn't established and it's foggy at best. How are you going to perform remote audits? So we hope that today's webinar will cover the technology aspects of that. There's been a number of webinars that talk about other aspects of remote auditing, but no one has covered the technology aspects to really facilitate and help you get these things done. So we can make our own future here if we are proactive and if we can establish the best practices that are in agreement across the board. Inaction will cost more than a couple of dollars in lost opportunity. It could cost your reputation if you are an audit site. Okay, so why you would consider using remote audits? Remote auditing has been recognized as a viable possibility for some time now. However, recently, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, it's become an absolute imperative. Right now, it's about the only way for these essential activities to be accomplished. As we move forward with our new normal, these become established remote audit offerings and many benefits that come from the remote audit, which were previously under-recognized or underplayed. In fact, recent industry experts on compliance inspections have stated that remote audits are likely going to become a much more useful tool in the future as companies and healthcare agencies become more well acquainted with the technology and the practice. And that's why we're here today, to lay out these best practices. So let's consider some reasons for remote auditing. You obviously may have certificates that you need to maintain, certifications of your sites, certifications by ISO or other qualifying bodies. Of course, the healthcare agency inspections, although FDA still purports that it must, at least at this point, have some component of an on-site inspection. It's not clear whether that's only for approval or whether that would be for all types of audits that the FDA performs. However, MHRA has been a little bit more flexible in terms of their recent statements around use of this type of technology or many types of technology in order to facilitate on-site inspections. Of course, there are the health and safety considerations. Obvious that today travel restrictions that are in place have moved this to the forefront of our mind in terms of why a remote audit would be considered. But in addition, there are cost benefits. There are significant savings in terms of travel expenses. Depending on how you do your audits, you may be able to leverage additional audit expertise based on availability, or simply their ability to apply multiple auditors to a particular audit, whereas in the past it might have been cost prohibitive to do so. And of course, there's the potential to perform more audits. If they're done remotely, that saves all the travel time and travel expense associated with the actual audit. So a more probably appropriate question is, why not consider a remote audit? So based on what we've heard from both sides, auditors, inspectors, and audit sites, it seems to be that the auditors or inspectors are really unfamiliar with the how portion of this approach, the how could this be accomplished, or the technology that's required to accomplish this in a way that's close enough to an on-site visit to enable that auditor to be comfortable that the audit is representative of what they would have done if they were physically on site. Now, from an audit site perspective, these organizations generally are not comfortable that their records and their documents are going to be secure. There seems to be a significant concern around any type of technology use that could potentially result in a video that would expose their intellectual property or proprietary equipment or any one of these aspects of their organization. But both sides definitely need to be considered, and in all cases, the reasoning why you're not using remote audit probably has to do with one of these two sides here. So when to use a remote audit, here we've identified some of the challenges. And of course, the most obvious one for everyone right now is the current pandemic situation. This has been a really stark example. But the reason why remote audits are not in use right away was primarily because no one was really prepared. There was not any best practices in place in order for people to jump right into something that would be a reasonable, or let's just call it an agreed alternative to the on-site audit. The cost of performing an on-site audit outweighs the value. So this is a situation where you might consider a remote audit. And in order to do that, you would need some way of comparing these. The risk of non-compliance is typically underestimated. However, there's also no clear risk evaluation method, at least historically. So we've provided, as a part of this webinar, a downloadable methodology to help you differentiate when a remote audit might be a reasonable alternative to an on-site audit. And of course, another reason when you might want to use a remote audit would be to accomplish more audits than your time or your budget allows. These are obviously faster to do. There's going to be a backlog of audits associated with many organizations, and there won't be a way to resolve that backlog without using a remote audit, because you can simply fit more audits into a week for any given auditor than you would be able to if you were traveling all over the place. However, the challenge is, objection to or a buy-in from the audit sites. So those things need to be addressed in order for you to use a remote audit. So if you have a buy-in from a site, a remote audit is going to be a very a very viable solution for you. So let's talk about the common audit practices that I mentioned before are associated with perhaps a GMP type audit. You would likely have all of these practices involved in an audit, whereas a different type of audit, you might just use some subset of these. You might not necessarily have a facility tour in all cases. Your document reviews might be not so general, but much more specific to data that's been collected on your behalf. These are typically agreed ahead of time, and sharing of those types of documents and data is something that's it's well understood in terms of the purpose of the audit. So we're covering these audit practices specifically because the technology that we're going to talk about can be used in all audit cases. In terms of the first parts of the audit, the non-disclosure agreement is something that is ubiquitously in place, doesn't necessarily require any technology specifically, other than if the groups are using electronic signatures, which really facilitates the speed of the process, but nonetheless, the activity is a typical part of the practice. The audit meeting itself, if you envision the on-site audit, the initial audit meeting when the parties get together, typically in a conference room, is the next most common part of the audit. This is where the agenda is typically reviewed, the parties who are going to be expected, the records that are going to be part of the scope, all that's laid out in advance. In many cases, however, the initial audit meeting is almost always part of the practice. And you can also think about this in the context of these things are intermingled. You know, for instance, the next set of activities, the facility tour and the staff interviews and the document reviews can be done in any order. They're not necessarily going to be an audit meeting and then that part is done. You may then transition into a partial or full facility tour, depending on the audit that you're performing. You may, during the course of that facility tour, perform some staff interviews or some document reviews. So as we go through these practices, we're going to talk about how the technology supports each one of these activities. And then at the end, we'll cover system reviews and just some of the interesting aspects that we've learned about system reviews as a part of an audit, and how that would be integrated into your remote audit. So for any audit to be successful, there are some base expectations that must be met, namely the ability for the auditor to have the appropriate chaperoned access to the audit-related operations and the ability to review related documents and records. These expectations would likely include a tour of the premises or the audit site, as well as interviews with appropriate staff without impacting their operation or their daily schedule. Well, it's really no different when performing a remote audit, but the method requires that we rely on technology to facilitate the prerequisites. And therefore, it has to be real time with no to low latency in terms of the communication with the remote parties. Secondly, the experience needs to be a high enough resolution so that the auditor can clearly see what they need to. And finally, the auditor needs to be able to direct their attention to various aspects, whether it's during a facility tour or to specific documents or something that they encounter during a tour. These things need to be at least under the control of the auditor, so they can ask questions about the particular item that they're concerned about. So just from a definitional standpoint, here we refer to live stream with low or no latency. This is basically the time that it takes for the audio or video signal to reach the audience in comparison to what's happening real time. And this becomes somewhat obvious when you're using 360 technology or live stream technology in comparison to, let's say, a two-way conversation over a cell phone or any kind of straight audio communication. So making sure that the low or no latency is not just, the live stream must have low or no latency in order to not disrupt the communications that are going on. A couple of seconds maybe between the 360 communication, or sorry, the 360 live stream and the audio communication between the parties is acceptable. Because of what the 360 communication, or sorry, the 360 video will bring to the advantage of the auditor. The resolution in terms of being high should be thought of in regards to the communication between the parties. Maybe not so much in terms of the 360 type of capability, but more so in regards to document reviews, face-to-face interactions for interviews and things like that. So we also should recognize that as far as remote auditing is concerned, that this technology is going to continually improve, and I think we'll see some of that discussion come up during some of the frequently asked questions. So in terms of the practice breakdown, we mentioned the audit meeting being one of those components that always occurs. In this case, the technology is largely supported by some sort of web conferencing type of software, whether you're using a Zoom or a GoToMeeting or WebEx. This technology is widely used, especially recently. Everyone has been exposed to these types of meetings now, and they're largely easy to set up and easy to operate. In terms of the best practices, either party can set up a web conference. The key part of the best practice is that there should be no recording of the meeting. And primarily this is based on the fact that no recording would go on during an on-site audit, and so therefore most of the parties, especially audit sites, are very highly aware or concerned about recordings being performed without their knowledge. Another best practice in regards to the meeting is that all parties should be both audio and video participants in the audit meeting. As you can see, in terms of what to avoid, we shouldn't be allowing necessarily audio-only participants in the meeting. Another best practice, though, is the use of a large monitor, and we would define that as something that was 24 to 27 inches diagonally in terms of the monitor, and something that was of relatively high, either a 1440 or 4K resolution. That's going to give you the best possible resolution that's available from the technology today. In terms of delays, that's something that you really should be avoiding in regards to setting up or the audit altogether, or just putting it off. There's no reason, once you get agreement to do these meetings, to put them off until some later date. Now, in terms of the facility tour, this is where the technology has really come a long way. by implementation of a 360-degree camera. These are lightweight and easy to use. They provide an unprecedented visibility into the audit site. The 360 camera allows the auditor to look in any direction they want without restrictions on where the camera is pointing, which would be something that you would typically see if it were just a handheld two-dimensional camera. In terms of the best practices associated with the 360 camera, it's also really important that this be a live stream. And that's critical for two reasons. This way the site can be assured that its confidentiality is being maintained because there's no recording. It's simply a live stream of that event. And when the live stream is over, there's no record being created of the event. In addition, the auditor does want to see things that are current, that are going on right now. They don't want to see some video that was made of a site, sometime in the past. That's not going to have the credibility or the value to an auditor that a live stream 360-degree broadcast would. In terms of the best practices for this facility tour, the real-time communication with the tour guide is essential. That way, during the 360 walkthrough, as the auditor is looking around the facility without any restrictions or without even any knowledge of by the chaperone, in this case, a tour guide, that auditor can ask questions, ask the tour guide to stop and ask questions about a particular item, particular thing that they see. And then, as you'll see as we get through some of the other practices, this is where the other technologies would come into play if they needed to see something in detail. So what's, I guess, obvious here to avoid is the recording of any type of a facility tour. The other aspect of this technology is that it is dependent on a connection of some sort. And obviously a Wi-Fi connection is the best, maybe second only to a cellular connection, depending on where your site is. That may be something that is possible or even preferable, depending on how extensive your facility is and whether there's any outdoor areas that need to be shown during the tour. The other limitation of this technology, at least currently, is that long tours should be avoided if possible. The portability of this equipment does limit, to a certain extent, its ability to do anything more than, say, 45 or 60 minutes of broadcast. So even though the simple battery change could be performed during the tour, if you can avoid long tours, long continuous tours, and break these up into something that would be, covering certain areas that had adequate Wi-Fi coverage, then stop and go back and maybe change the batteries out and then start another part of the tour later on. It would all be something that your planning would certainly cover if you knew you were going to do a remote audit. And then finally, the other issue to be aware of and avoid is areas that don't have adequate Wi-Fi or cellular coverage, meaning within the audit site, you would want to make sure that they have adequate coverage with their Wi-Fi over the areas that you as the auditor would want to look at. And in many cases, this is just something that can be checked or verified as a a pre-audit activity. The auditor can simply ask the question if they knew that they're doing a remote audit, are all of the areas covered by adequate Wi-Fi? And it certainly is easy enough to simply download an app to your phone and walk around the facility and make sure that you have an adequate Wi-Fi signal. And normally this can all be done over the site's guest network. There's no reason that they would have to have access to anything other than a guest network that has no other access to confidential documents or file stores at the facility. Now, in terms of 360 cameras, I've got a couple of examples here. What we're trying to demonstrate is that these are not mechanical cameras, as referenced here on the left. There's no moving parts, as you can see by the example on the right. These are small. Here it's represented against the size of a cell phone, and very easy to use, as represented by the simple 2 buttons that it takes to utilize that camera, in comparison to something a lot more unwieldy. As you can see, it's the example on the left, certainly would not work well in terms of performing a facility tour if you had to lug around a giant camera and all of the associated communication and power equipment that would be necessary for that. So those would be kind of non-starters if you were trying to use that kind of a technology versus what is available in the technology today. There are many of these types of cameras on the market, but you do have to be aware that not all of them are live stream capable. So that's something that you need to watch out for and choose carefully. In terms of the viewing of the site tour using the 360 camera, the way that that works, as you see, are a couple of examples here. The virtual goggles is a possibility, believe it or not. It's certainly all has to do with the viewing, and that's doable with the right player onto a phone, as you can see in our little example here. By putting that onto a headset, then you really get the immersive type feeling by just moving your head. Similarly with a tablet, by moving that tablet right or left, your view would change to the right or to the left, as opposed to the third option, which is probably the easiest to understand. And I have an example that we can play here to represent how it would work for a simple audit shown on a browser or something like that. I can start this video, and of course this is a video, so this was pre-recorded simply for the purposes of this demonstration. So you can see that right now I can move it even though it's not been started in terms of the video, and that's because the video stream has provided me a 360-degree image in all cases. So this does take quite a bit of data to be sent to the viewing side, and that's why you have to have the right viewer and the right connections in order to make this happen. But for the most part, the available technology today will facilitate this. So you can see, all I have to do is use my mouse and move that around. And this video, the audit site tour guide is going to come along, and he's going to pick up the camera because it's easy enough for them to pick up. You can see here it's just a very small footprint. They pick it up with 2 fingers and they can move it around, and that allows them to stop at your request and maybe answer some questions about what you're looking at, and then they can simply point to things when you can look at them and talk to them And that's why the latency of this part of the live stream becomes important. And then you can say, all right, well, I think I've seen what I need to see here. And then the tour guide can move on to another area. But while they're moving, and at any point you can look around and see any part of the area that you want to see. You can see how it pixelates a little bit because of all that data that's being transferred so quickly. But once the tour guide stops, everything is pretty much visible. So then we can move on with our webinar here and talk about staff interactions, staff interviews, and the use of the detail camera. Now, there's a number of reasons why having a separate camera from the 360 camera is necessary and appropriate. The detail camera is equally light and easy to use, but it does have a high resolution and low latency requirement as well. And this can be accomplished using a IP camera that is connected, say, from your cell phone into a Zoom call. That should give you the real-time communication and a reasonable amount of resolution in case you want to interview someone or you need to look at something specific during the facility tour. At any time, you could use, however, the detail camera to either look at a document, whether it's during the tour or whether it's after the tour. And you could use it to look at different details about, let's say, a piece of equipment or an instrument that you're encountering along the way. In terms of the detail camera, in this case, it should allow for a two-way communication, and in this case, a cell phone is usually perfectly adequate for this type of technology, as long as you can see the auditor, the person who's asking the questions, and the person can see you. And as I mentioned, the ability for the auditor to communicate is really the most important thing in terms of the value of that camera during the 360 or site tour. Moving on now to document reviews. The aspect of paper documents is still very much alive and well, and in many of the facilities today, the use of paper is still quite evident to most of you who've done these types of manufacturing facility tours. For this purpose, you might need to ensure that you have a document camera, something that is equally lightweight and easy to use, but provides you with a stationary high resolution and again low latency view of whatever it is that you're looking at. This can be a live stream camera or an IP camera, such as those things that are attached to your laptops. Those usually provide a high enough resolution, but this is something that you would want to make sure that you have adequate resolution so that you can review, let's say, a handwritten document that's part of your manufacturing record, or a logbook, or something of that nature that's being provided to you as evidence of an activity. The consideration for fitting larger documents such as binders or logbooks or multiple sheets of paper should also be something that you're thinking about with regards to paper document reviews when you're thinking about the technology here. There are a number of cameras that are available on the market that simply plug into a laptop and provide a stationary camera with a flexible arm that allows you to just point the camera in the downward direction, and therefore documents can be placed out on the conference table, same as they would have been if you were on site. Now, during this type of activity, it is important that the auditor remains visible to the people who they're talking to, because the focus of the camera, the resolution of the camera, and probably most important, the context of what it is that you're looking at is really important to the auditor. It could waste a lot of time to just push documents as a scan over to an auditor, and if without the immediate context of what it is that they're looking at, it can be confusing. Sometimes the entire document's not of interest to the auditor, but only a portion of the document. And so in this way, having a real-time document review capability is something that is essential to a good audit. Okay, so moving on to document reviews associated with electronic documents. Now, in this case, the recommendation is to use the latest document rights, digital rights management software. This really provides the highest level of security. It's easily applicable to PDF files, and it really allows for a thorough review of those documents without any security concerns on the part of the audit site. Typically what happens with the digital rights management software is it will take a PDF file and convert it to what's called a PDC file, which is an encrypted PDF file, and that's done prior to any sharing of the document. And then from that point, the auditor has the ability to look at those things, even potentially add a comments or highlights to the document so that they can come back and look at these things and ask questions later on. And the value in terms of security is that these will allow visibility to the document, but not allow for printing or copying, or even in some cases, screen captures. So you can feel perfectly safe about sharing your documents using this type of software. Now, for electronic documents, largely we see that these are policies and procedures and other sort of long-term records. It is possible that some sort of printout or report has been converted into PDF as well. But largely, if it's something that exists in paper, it's very difficult to get these things scanned and then put into a PDF format in a very quick fashion if there's a large volume of documents that the auditor is requesting. So often this becomes somewhat of a planning question for your audit. However, what you want to avoid here is just randomly sharing documents using cloud storage or data rooms or things like that. And this is especially true for the audit site. This is usually where they get very concerned about sharing documents depending on what the document is and the type of document. They will be concerned for the security of those documents. So largely the ability to share those without the concerns is an extreme advantage to the audit site. Now, moving on to system record reviews. That technology is something that you are looking at largely right now. This is screen sharing that's available through your web conferencing software. This would be used to share some records that exist on a system. So the web conference applications enable this so that the auditor can review system data in real time. This allows the auditor to look at those details in the company's quality management system or on the respective system where the records are stored. And this is not unusual request for a QP or an ISO qualifying body to make these types of requests. And in fact, in recent panel discussions with industry QA representatives from pharma companies, they were very accepting of this type of idea as long as there was not actual access provided to the auditor or investigator in many of those cases. That has its own issues associated with training and really knowing what you're looking for. And it's always a lot better if you know what the auditor is looking for, so you can put the information into context for them, and this avoids any kind of prolonged fishing expeditions on the part of the auditor. Now, moving on to third-party participants. Many auditors are technically third parties that are acting on behalf of the auditing organization, so it's perfectly acceptable to use third parties for supporting audit technology as well. Such companies as Zoom, for the audit communication tool, in essence, you're utilizing their technology when you have your web conference. If you're using them to facilitate a remote audit, then in effect you have that third party involvement. So many smaller companies don't have the technical or communication expertise to enable these capabilities for you, but they are available, and therefore, where necessary and appropriate, you should seek them out to support your remote audits if you don't have that in-house capability. Now, we have a couple of frequently asked questions as we try to wrap things up for you here. So some of the questions that have come to us in the past were, what kind of internet connection is needed for the 360 live stream technology to work? Well, in this case, most companies have an on-site guest network that would work just fine for broadcasting live stream 360. The cellular service is also an option. If you're a little bit more technology leaning, it would be something on the order of a 2.4 megahertz network, that Wi-Fi signal that was necessary, as opposed to a 5 megahertz network. In the case of cellular, the capabilities exist now in certain areas for the 5G technology that's specific to cellular networks. And this is really going to open up the broadcasting capability around the world. So if you're in an area where a 5G cellular network is available, that is a tremendous advantage to any kind of broadcasting capability that you would be doing, and you really would have no problem whether it was a 2.4 Wi-Fi network or a reasonable signal on a cellular network. Certainly if you had a 5G network nearby from a cellular perspective, that would really give you the best option today in terms of broadcasting capability. But it does work perfectly well on on just a regular Wi-Fi network. I guess the thing to mention there in regards to that technology is something we referenced earlier, and that would be just making sure that if there is going to be a remote audit, that some sort of question about having Wi-Fi access in all the areas that would be appropriate to your audit is a question you'd want to ask in advance. Next question, what are some of the other technology challenges in using a 360 camera? Well, there really aren't too many, but the people on the viewing end of the 360 broadcast, they're going to typically, as I demonstrated here, access this through a browser interface. But in order to do that, that does require a special video player. These are widely available. Things like YouTube have a bunch of 360 video players out there. But therefore, the user, has to have that interface set up in advance of the call, if that's something that you're thinking about using. So it's not just as simple as sending a video and hoping that the people on the receiving end have the ability to view 360. That would have to be set up on both ends, essentially. The next question, why not just connect a smartphone to the web conference and let someone walk around the audit site? Well, we certainly have seen this, and I think most of you would recognize pretty quickly that it's certainly possible, but does that really give the auditor the ability to direct the camera, to direct the audit in a way that would be best suited for them? Whereas with the 360 camera, they can look in any direction they want, zoom in and out if the camera has that capability, and then bring to the attention of the person who's doing the tour any questions that you have, and at that point, if details are needed, you can utilize the detail camera that we talked about as one of the other necessary components. Okay, another question we see quite often is, what if the audit site has policies against photography or videos? Well, almost every company in the world now is using a live stream during conference calls like this webinar, right? The ability for companies to perform this needs to be considered as a part of what they just have to do in order to maintain business now. So the idea of the original policy statement prohibiting pictures or videos was really specifically oriented towards keeping those I guess, records from getting out there, record of their facility through a photograph or through a video, getting out of their control. And that's why the use of a live stream that is not recorded is an essential part of this. And it should be differentiated from just the ubiquitous term of video. Okay, so lastly, why is sharing documents via a cloud storage not a good idea? Well, today many organizations share documents with document rooms or cloud storage, but there's usually a known party on the other end. In this case, you could argue, well, you have a confidentiality agreement, non-disclosure agreement with those parties. But there's still security concerns with putting your information out there. Some organizations may choose to put these out on their own secured cloud storage, but then they have to provide access to that outside party, and that takes time and effort to do. And the digital rights management approach really prohibits any type of, let's say, misuse of those documents. It prohibits the ability to print to copy, and in some cases to even take screenshots if you're using the right digital management software. So this is a much better secure option than simply using a cloud storage service. Okay, so just to recap for you quickly, in terms of the summary of technology must-haves for successful remote audits, we are recommending as the best practices a 360-degree live stream with low or no latency that can be controlled by the auditor. And of course, simultaneously real-time two-way communication, both audio and video. And that can be the combination of your audit meeting software that we talked about and the detail camera that we talked about that gives you that real-time communication. The ability to have high resolution for viewing paper documents, that would be your document camera, and similarly on the side of the auditor, having an adequate resolution on their monitor is equally important. And then, of course, making sure that the auditor has the ability to control the review of the content. So that means both the facility tour and the documentation as it's provided. As we talked about, that should be done in a way that allows the context of the document to be provided to the auditor so that there's not a lot of time wasted around looking at documents that don't have the proper context. And lastly, I think another real essential part of remote audit best practice is that these things need to be easy to set up and easy to operate. Right now, it's going to be critical that these audits are getting done, and the easier that this process is made will enable this to get to more of a ubiquitous use throughout the industry. We have provided a couple of resource references here at the end of the webinar for you so that you can look up some of the things that we've discussed and some of the content, where it comes from, and some references. Lastly, I'd just like to thank ASQ and all of you who attended today. If you have any questions, you can reach me at my email here. Thanks very much.
Thank you again, Pete, for providing our listeners with this great presentation. To learn more about Pete Miller, you can email him directly with your questions at peter.miller@dcs-i.com. You can also check out their website, which is Dynamic Compliance Solutions, Inc., and that's at dcsrac.com. For more information on this topic through ASQ, you can check out ASQ's webcast archive, and that's at asq.org/quality-resources/webcast for more on the topics of auditing and leveraging new technologies. Or you can search ASQ's Quality Resource Center, and that's at asq.org/quality-resources. All right, thanks again, and we hope that you'll all join us for our next webcast event.